My story took place when I was 13 years old. It might seem a little old for trick-or-treating for some, but I know I really enjoyed it. I actually feared aging and growing a bit, because I knew there was gonna be a time in which I could not do this anymore. Fortunately, when I was a teenager, I was still a bit small for my age, so I could still get away with it. And no, I don't just like to trick-or-treat for the candy. It's the whole atmosphere of trick-or-treating that I love. I enjoy the whole neighborhood overflowing with children, dressed in nice costumes. I like the houses that go all out in their Halloween decorations, and I like seeing the sheer creativity of everyone, while also experiencing an atmosphere completely based on horror. The one bad thing about being 13 and going trick-or-treating, though, was that all of my friends who were around my age didn't feel the same way as I did about it. This meant I usually had to go all alone. It didn't really bug me too much, though, as at least I could go at my own pace, walking around the neighborhood as I liked. Eventually, though, I noticed I didn't seem to be the only older kid that was trick-or-treating. There was one kid who had to be a few years older than me. I based this on the fact that he was just pretty huge. I can't say how tall he was exactly, but he was pretty damn tall, and he was dressed as some sort of mummy. His costume was actually really good. He didn't go for the cheap toilet paper mummy look used by some kids. He used some really nice cloth. All in all, it was actually a very cool-looking costume. Early in the night, I was admiring his costume. I guess perhaps I was watching him too closely, though, because at one point he walked by me and said, "What the hell are you looking at?" He also bumped into me as he walked by. I sorta messed up when he did that, and I told him to fuck off. This seemed to make the guy very angry, because he started following me after that. He didn't do anything at first, but I could tell that he had to be pretty pissed off. Whenever I would hit a house, he would hit it right after me. This kept up for quite a while. I tried to up my speed and lose him several times, but each time he eventually caught back up with me. I couldn't really understand why he was doing this. He didn't try to hurt me or anything. I actually doubted he would try that with the amount of people that were around. I just thought maybe he was trying to make my experience unpleasant by scaring me or making me nervous. I sort of realized as we went along, though, what he really seemed to be up to. He was trying to make it seem like he was simply trick-or-treating, when in reality he was only trying to keep up with me because he knew the crowd would eventually disperse. When it did, he would know where I was. I've had problems with bullies before, but this one in particular really scared me. I tried my best to lose him in the crowd like I mentioned, but it was not easy. He just kept on catching up with me somehow. Shortly after I'd leave a house, even if I ran away and hid, I'd make it to another one and just see him coming along his way. As the crowd of kids got thinner and thinner, I finally realized I might have to forgo my trick-or-treating and just go home altogether. It would be much safer to go home while the trick-or-treating was still in full force. Even though I didn't have anywhere near as much of a haul as I would have liked, I set out on my way home. He tried to follow me still through the throngs of children, but that really didn't bother me too much. I knew that once I was safe in my home, it really wouldn't matter. There was very little he'd be able to do to me at that point. I thought I'd lost him by the time I got home. I couldn't see him anywhere. My house was completely dark because my parents were not home. They had gone out to a Halloween party. Still, there were enough children and adults out in the streets that I was not too concerned about being in danger. I made my way into my house, and I thought I was fine. I spent the rest of the night watching scary movies, eating popcorn and candy. My parents weren't going to be back until late that night, but that was okay with me. I was sure the guy was gone now. I had spent several hours all alone and feeling safe inside my house, when at about 11 o'clock, I heard my doorbell ring. I thought this was pretty odd, so I got up and walked to the door. Looking out of the window in the door, I didn't see anyone on the porch. For some reason, my mind went back to that mummy. I really didn't worry about him too much though. I was in my house after all. I wasn't worried he could do anything to me. I figured I'd open the door only slightly to see if maybe there was a small trick-or-treater who was out really late or something. Maybe they came by my house as they were leaving. I unlocked the door and had just begun to open it up. The moment I did though, it happened so fast I could barely process it. A bandaged hand grabbed the door and flung it open with such force it pulled me down to the ground. I was grabbed after I was laying on the porch. I was picked up and pushed against the wall of my house. It was the mummy. He punched me several times in the stomach, then grabbed me around the neck. I started crying and panicking, thinking this son of a bitch was going to try and kill me. I really began to lose my breath. I flailed around, trying to do anything to get this guy off me. My head began getting dizzy as tears fell down from my eyes. I really thought I was going to die. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I heard someone yell out from behind us. Shortly afterwards, I fell to the ground. My neighbor had heard the commotion and come running out of their house. I was gasping for air, so I didn't notice it, but the mummy ran off after. My neighbor came to check on me. Rather than go after the mummy, they made sure I was okay. I'm pretty thankful for that. Fortunately, I was not seriously hurt. I had some minor injuries, but physically I was able to recover pretty fast. Mentally was a completely different story though. I don't know if I ever saw the mummy again. That's the problem. I had no idea who he was, but whenever I saw someone who was tall like him, inwardly I would begin to panic. That took me a very, very long time to come to terms with. Some people I just can't understand why they do the things they do. During Halloween, I like to be one of those really cool houses that all the trick-or-treaters like to go to. I buy the really good candy, and I buy lots of it too. I think the kids always look forward to coming to my house because they know they're gonna get the quality stuff. One Halloween, however, I had a really bad experience. Well, I guess it was slightly after Halloween since it technically occurred after midnight. I'd had a pretty good night up to that point. A lot of kids had come by that night, and I still had a lot of candy left over after the trick-or-treating died down. I concentrated on just having a night watching some Halloween specials on TV. I live in a pretty good neighborhood, and we're not known for having pranksters or anything like that. There were no houses getting egged as far as I knew, and there were no flaming piles of dog shit around either. Around 1 a.m., I was playing video games when I heard a knock at the door. I thought it was a bit odd, but I put down my controller and went to check who was there. I opened it up slightly because there was no peephole, and no one was there. I didn't give it too much thought in the moment. I just assumed it was some kids doing a ding-dong ditch thing. About 10 minutes later, though, I heard another knock on the door. I was a little bit irritated this time because I was now under the impression that kids were playing pranks on me, and I really didn't have the patience for such a thing. I got up angrily and marched over to the door. Then I opened it again. There wasn't anyone at the door once again, but this time there was one of those orange jack-o'-lantern buckets just sitting on the porch. It was empty, and it was just sitting there. Looking at the door, I got a bit annoyed and kicked the bucket off my porch and onto the sidewalk. I then said loudly that I wasn't in the mood for stupid games. I would get really pissed off if anyone knocked on my door again. I went back and started playing video games again. Some time had passed now, and there weren't any further knocks at my door. I was pretty happy about that for a while. However, as I was sitting there, something caught my eye just off to the side. I looked over at the window, expecting to see something there, but there seemed to be nothing. I went back to playing my game, when after a while it happened again. This time I looked over at the window as fast as I could, and I saw that same jack-o'-lantern bucket was being held up in front of the window. I was definitely caught off guard. Someone must be there holding it and making it seem as if it was looking in through the window. I got up and mentioned that whoever this was, I didn't find their game very funny. I also mentioned that if they didn't want to piss me off, they needed to stop this right now. When I said that, though, the person turned the jack-o'-lantern back and forth as if they were shaking their head no. I was very not amused at this point. I told them to get the hell away from my house. Once again, the jack-o'-lantern shook its head. "All right," I said. "I've had it with this crap. I'm gonna go get my baseball bat." I turned to walk down the hallway and into my bedroom. I grabbed my aluminum baseball bat, prepared to beat the crap out of whoever was playing this joke on me. When I got back to the living room, however, the jack-o'-lantern was no longer in the window. I began to look around at the other windows to see if the person had simply changed locations around my house. As I was looking around, though, I heard a crashing sound out on my front porch. I walked out the door to confront the person and immediately slipped on something. While I tried to catch my balance, I caught someone dressed in all black, holding that jack-o'-lantern bucket. They lit it on fire, and they threw that bucket at me. Just like in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, that bucket smacked me right in the face. I fell over. I got up and started covering myself with some dirt from a potted plant to put out the fire. I then looked around to see where the guy who'd thrown this at me was. He was gone already. It looked like what I'd slipped in was some sort of blood. I looked around further and saw there was a dead groundhog on my porch. Written in blood on my front door was "Trick or treat, I'll be back." I wasn't scared until that point. I just thought it was some lame joke, but anyone sick enough to kill a groundhog and write something in his blood on my door, just knowing what they'd done to it while I was playing video games, it creeped me the hell out. So, I don't really know how scary this story is to anyone else, but it is really creepy. It's not too long an incident either, but when I was 11 years old, I went trick-or-treating with my two best friends. My friend Carl's sister was 15, and she was supposed to be chaperoning us. That's the only way our parents would let us go out without them. As you might imagine for a teenager though, she did not spend much time with us. When she ran into her boyfriend and a couple of his buddies, she asked us if we'd mind trick-or-treating all by ourselves. Of course, we readily agreed. We were all too eager to get away from her. She told us to meet her back in this area in about 2 hours. We got a pretty good candy haul. It was about 20 minutes before we had to rendezvous with Carl's sister, when we came across that house. You know the one I mean. The one house in the neighborhood that everyone talks about. Now, this wasn't an abandoned house. It wasn't boarded up or anything. However, it did have a completely dead lawn and was littered with garbage. A shredded tire swing hung from a leafless tree. There was even an old beat-up ice cream truck in the yard. Now, the guy who lived there was someone that rarely anyone ever saw. We all had all sorts of stories about him. We talked about him and made up all these different theories for what was wrong with him. Some of us said he was a serial killer who got off on a technicality or something. The story, supposedly, was that he would ride around in his ice cream truck giving kids poisoned ice cream. The prevailing theory, though, was that he was a mentally incapacitated guy who still lived with his mom until the day she passed away. They said he was unable to understand what had happened, and not able to take care of the property well either. He'd waited weeks after she passed away waiting for her to wake up, I guess. Supposedly, when the police found them, she had decayed pretty badly and he was still trying to feed her. Now, honestly, if you asked me, both of those stories were complete bullshit, but they were pretty popular stories in the neighborhood. Anyway, to kids our age, they were scary enough to keep us from wanting to go up to that house. There was a jack-o'-lantern out on the porch though, and it had a burning candle in it. We figured the guy must be waiting for trick-or-treaters, so the three of us kept daring each other to go up to that house. Of course, none of the three of us really wanted to go up there. We just wanted one of the others to take the dare and go alone. When none of us did, We agreed to just go up to the house together. Up on the porch was Carl, who had the balls to knock on the door. After a moment, the door opened, and the man answered it. He was dressed in a Frankenstein costume and seemed delighted to see us. He went on and on about how he never got trick-or-treaters at his house. He'd always wanted some because he really liked kids. He disappeared into his house and came back with a bowl of something. He reached in and grabbed a handful of it, then put it in Carl's bag. Before Carl could even react, he then put a handful of something into my bag as well. I looked down to see a glob of raw meat. The man had this insane look on his face. He gave our third friend another glob of mysterious meat, then said to enjoy the treats. We boys were freaked out, and we ran out of his yard until we found Carl's sister. She was pissed at us for going to that house in the first place. However, she really couldn't tell on us, because then she would get in trouble too. That mystery meat had completely destroyed our candy, but she let us do a bit more trick-or-treating now. We definitely spread that story after that experience. At least this was one story about the guy we knew was true. This happened around 2008 or so. I'm a male and was 23 at the time this all began. It was the weekend, and an old high school friend reconnected with me online. We decided to go grab a beer at a bar by his town, which was the same town I'd gone to college at. It was my turn to buy a round, so I went up to the bar of this dim, dirty dive bar and asked for a bucket of beers. As I was waiting for my drinks, a girl suddenly approached me. Let's call her Jane. Hey, do you remember me? She started acting really flirtatious. I didn't know and couldn't even think of a way I'd met her before though, so I said something like, I'm sorry, I talked to a lot of people at my job. Can you refresh my memory? She stated she'd taken some class with me and worked with me on a group project. I still had no idea who she was, however, and couldn't remember ever working on such a thing together. She knew my name and the class I was in, though. I wasn't really interested in talking to her, so I politely said, well, nice to see you. I went back to my friend at the table and tried to ignore that incident. I left about an hour later and headed home. I remember I took a shower and was just getting ready to go to bed. I checked my phone before I climbed in and saw an unknown number had called me 2 different times and also texted me and left a voicemail. This was all during the short time I'd been in the shower, mind you. The text was from Jane, saying it had been great to see me, and I looked so cute, or something along those lines. Again, I didn't want to lead this girl on, so I politely responded saying it was cool to see her as well. I was obviously weirded out, because I never exchanged phone numbers at the bar. Maybe she had it on an old list if she was really in my class. When I woke up the next morning, I had over 10 texts sent to me, inviting me over for a hookup. It was just point blank telling me to come over. I laughed it off at first, and was kind of flattered. My thought was she must have drank a whole lot that night. I didn't respond as I felt it would be quite awkward. That's when the real shit began, though. I worked in an office where I could not have my cell phone out while working. It's a very professional environment. On my break, I powered up my phone, only to see 19 missed calls and 100+ texts. Approximately 10 voicemails as well. I freaked out. Surely there must have been an emergency or something, but everything was from Jane. Those messages went from hellos to sexual advances to anger why I'm not answering. Sobbing, sorries, threats of violence if I didn't respond. I was beyond freaked out. I texted to see if she was okay or needed some help or something. She then responded that it was the greatest day of her life hearing back from me. I let her know I felt her messages were inappropriate and I didn't want to give her any feelings I wanted to date her. From the beginning, this whole thing was so odd to me. I began getting 40+ calls and messages. I decided it would be best to just stop responding at this point. This went on for over a week, day and night. calls and messages. Then, one message caught my eye. She mentioned where I work, but again, I'd never told her this. There was a Wendy's a stone's throw away from my job. I got paranoid leaving work, thinking she must have been following me somehow, so I'd drive around the Wendy's and wait in the drive-thru for a while before going home from work. I remember sending her one last message stating that if she contacted me again, I would call the police from then on. At the time, I had to pay a monthly fee on my cell phone to have a number blocked, but I never heard from her again after. And from all the research I've done, it doesn't appear I actually had any classes with her either. I used to get into a lot of fights with my stepmother. Things were pretty crappy at home, ever since she married my dad. I asked my mom if I could come stay with her for a while, but it seemed she was too busy to house me. It really sucked, honestly. Things just got more and more difficult, and it eventually all came to a head when my stepmom accused me of stealing something from her. Of course, I hadn't done this, but my dad immediately believed her over me, and we got into a huge fight about it. I really couldn't take it anymore. After they went to sleep, I packed up a duffel bag and a tiny bit of money I had, and left for a couple of nights on my own. I was able to sleep at a friend's house at first, but I was only 16, so that really didn't last very long at all. After about 4 or 5 nights, I was faced with the harsh reality of sleeping on the streets. It scared me for sure, but not enough to make me go home after that big argument. My first night on the streets, though, was probably worse than you can ever imagine. It was just a complete nightmare. I didn't really sleep at all. I tried to sleep at the train station at first, but the doors were locked, so I slept outside instead. I felt myself drifting off a few times, but I really couldn't get any sleep. I did have a little bit of money on me, so the next day I took the train into the city. I figured there would be more places to sleep there. It turned out I was right. The following night I found myself holed up in an alleyway, and I curled up next to the garbage can. I actually did manage to sleep for a while, before I felt a sharp tapping wake me up. I jumped and grabbed my bag. There was a girl there who also looked homeless. She was fairly nice actually though, and told me it was dangerous to sleep in such a place. She told me there was a nicer place nearby where people were squatting, and she asked me if I wanted to accompany her. Although I was scared at first, I realized it might be better to get some sleep with other people around. I went there with her. I followed her there. There were a lot of people squatting in this old home actually. It seemed kinda weird actually. People were grouped together in circles talking quietly. I really didn't know how much more comfortable I was going to be there than in the alleyway, but she took me into a room that only 2 other guys were in. It seemed she knew them all, and they all welcomed me with friendly smiles. They wanted to know if I wanted to hang out. I found out a few minutes later she would be doing heroin with them. I let them know I was only interested in sleeping. I was not into the whole idea of getting hooked on drugs. I was so tired though that them doing heroin in the same room didn't even bother me. I figured I wasn't going to do it, so it was no big deal. I went into the corner for a little bit. I actually watched what they were doing. I was tired, yeah, but I guess now I was also a bit scared of them and curious about how they were doing this. It was hard to watch, especially when the girl did it. I mean, she had been nice before, but now she was just acting all weird and crazy. I liked her because she had helped me, but I didn't want to be anywhere near her in this moment. Watching them all shoot that stuff up was really hard, but after a while, I actually managed to doze off a bit. Later though, I felt someone up against me, which woke me up almost immediately. I opened my eyes, and it was the girl from before. She smiled at me, and I did too. I was just about to close my eyes when she rubbed my pants a bit. We were both too out of it to do anything though, so she fell asleep right on top of me. Later on though, I felt someone tugging at my arm or doing something with it. It was really annoying. I thought it must have been the girl who had woken up since, though. I tried to keep the sleep going, but I woke up immediately when I felt a sharp pain shoot through my arm. Opening my eyes, I saw a much older man standing over me. I hadn't seen it before. Right in my face, though, he had pulled my shirt sleeve up and put some sort of band on my arm. It only took a few moments for me to realize this guy was going to shoot me up with heroin while I was sleeping. "What the hell are you doing?" I screamed. I tried to pull my arm away from him. "I'm gonna kill you like you killed her," he said, motioning towards the girl. I looked over at her only to see she was lying with her head against the wall, clearly breathing perfectly fine. I pointed out to the man that she was still alive, but the man grabbed hold of my arm even tighter. Most of what happened next was almost a blur. He had a needle at the ready, but I resisted as hard as I could. Eventually, I got a good kick on the guy, and he let go of me with his hand. I grabbed my bag and sprinted out of the house. I kept running until I found a place to hide until the following morning. The following day, I found a shelter for runaway teens and stayed there for as long as they would let me. It was a long time, and there was no happy ending to be found anytime soon. I never went back to my parents, and I didn't see them for years, actually. I lived in shelters, hopping back and forth, until I eventually got a job and then an apartment, and made something with my life in the end. Things got really bad after my dad died. My mom fell into a deep depression for years. She ended up marrying this awful guy who just used her all the time and hated us kids. It really sucked because she would have never given a guy like him the time of day beforehand. Things got really rough for me and my brothers and sisters. As the oldest, I did my best to try and protect the others, but it didn't really work. When I was 15, my stepdad hit my younger brother, and he and I got into an all-out fist fight. My mom immediately took his side when she came home from work and kicked me out of the house. I literally had nowhere to go. We had moved a lot of times after my dad passed away, and I really didn't have any good friends because of this. We didn't have any family nearby either. We lived a bit out in the country, so it wasn't like there were shelters or anything nearby. I spent a couple of days wandering around in the hills. Actually, it was the only thing I could think to do. There were multiple abandoned buildings I'd found that I could sleep in for a little while. There were also plenty of creeks with fresh water to drink. This was in the late spring, too, so there were some apple trees I could steal apples from. You might be surprised about how I didn't run into any people for a long time. Hell, it was surprising to me too. There were tons of hills though, and they went on and on and on. Even with nobody around to worry about though, it was still hell. I had to sleep with a tiny blanket I had packed and used my jacket for a pillow. I slept on the splintered floors of these abandoned little sheds, or whatever they happened to be. The whole time, I was worried someone would stumble down from the mountains and catch me or something. One evening, I was sitting back in a small building, reading a book by flashlight. That was when I heard a strange sound, like a man groaning or something. I got up and looked out the window on the door of the shed. It was extremely dark outside, but I did just about manage to make out a shadowy figure of someone standing about 50 yards away. I quickly turned off my light. I had put a padlock on the door. I had brought one with me for safety when I got kicked out. I had always planned to sleep in these abandoned houses if that ever happened, so I knew I would need some extra protection in the form of that padlock. I watched the man from inside the shed. He was walking around, but mostly in my direction. Now, this shed was quite old, and you could tell no one had used it in decades. This guy was coming right towards it though, and he also seemed to have something ready in his hand. It was long, but I couldn't quite tell what it was. It might have been a gun or a particularly large knife. who knows what. When I realized the guy was making a beeline towards the shed now, I did the only thing I could think to do. I took my blanket and went over to the farthest corner of the shed. I hid under the blanket and piled some dirt and random debris on top of me. I hoped in the dark he would not be able to distinguish me from my surroundings. I was too afraid to look out of my blanket to even see if he was there though. It felt like a long time passed. I was just about to peek out from underneath when suddenly I heard some more sounds, as if someone was trying to bust open the door. They began pulling extremely hard, and I heard the lock jiggling back and forth. I began to get very scared. It was even worse though, when the man began slamming something against the door. I almost crapped my pants as the pounding got fiercer and fiercer. He didn't begin yelling or anything, but rather started speaking in a strange gibberish I could not understand. I was scared and shivering. Whatever he was saying, he was clearly in some sort of tranquil fury. After a while, he stopped pounding. I thought he'd finally decided to give up, but he began to kick on the door and started yelling this time. I heard a gunshot and an awful guttural sound. I found out later that was a bullet going through the wood of the door. He shot the door several more times. I was crying silently in the shed, hoping he couldn't hear me. Not long after this flurry of shots, the man stopped pounding on the door. I was damn impressed with how strong that old rotting door was. That came later though. After he stopped pounding on the door, he must have walked away because it got real quiet. I waited there for what seemed like hours. It might have actually been hours now that I think about it. I thought maybe the guy was the owner of the land in the shed or something. Why else would this guy be out in the middle of the night in the mountains? Maybe he was some crazy hermit or wanderer or something. Whatever it was scary as hell. When I finally had the nerve to crawl out, I peeked through the window and saw that no one was there. Although I was terrified, I stayed in that shed for the rest of the night. The following day, I went home. Turns out my mom had been looking for me because her new husband had hit one of my other siblings while I was out. I guess she didn't realize that he was lying and kicked him out after. I can't lie to you, it was extremely hard to forgive her, but I eventually did so, and I was just happy to be home at the end of the day. There was a time when I left home as a teenager. I don't want to get into the specifics too much. It was a real nasty time, and my parents seemed real nasty to me too. Looking back, it was probably just as much my fault though as it was theirs. I was a bit of a jerk. Anyway, we got into this big, huge fight, and I told them I was going to leave. They said, "Well fine, see what it's like out there on your own." I decided to do just that. I thought everything would be fine. I went to live with a guy named Chaz. He had been a pretty cool guy in all the time I'd known him. He lived alone with his father, who was barely ever home anyway. Seemed like the ideal situation to me. They lived out in a rural area, in a beautiful home. We knew each other really well, so he let me crash on his bedroom floor without much fuss. That was fine with me. I really didn't know much about Chaz's father though. What was stranger was that Chaz wouldn't tell me much about him either. I even asked him one time what his dad did for a living, and he basically said he didn't even know. I found that especially odd, but he said they didn't really spend much time together. He told me he pretty much had to raise himself, as his dad was basically never there. He just gave him money whenever he asked for it. Anything else was pretty much all up to him. Eventually, his father did show up, and I ended up having a weird little interaction with him. He seemed to have known I had been there for a good 2 months before I had this freaky experience. Chaz and I were up late watching movies in the living room when his dad just suddenly came home. He just ripped open the door without even saying anything. I was a bit afraid of the way the man was stomping around. I thought he might have been angry that I was staying there with him, but he just left the room. When he came back around, he was carrying some sort of semi-automatic rifle with him. He told us in an angry voice to either go to Chaz's room or stay away from the windows and get down. I wanted to run and hide immediately, but Chaz didn't want to go to his room and locked it with several different locks. I watched him carefully, seeing him pacing in front of the house back and forth. After a while, I saw a light of what seemed to be several pickup trucks pulling up to the home. The light shone in through the living room window and nearly blinded me. I asked Chaz if we should get the hell out of there right now. He simply told me not to worry about it, and this had happened several times before. It was likely not going to turn into anything. I heard Chaz's dad screaming some things at the guys in the trucks. I heard them yelling back at him. I couldn't really understand what any of them were saying, though. I took Chaz's word that this wasn't that big a deal, but it wasn't easy to do that, especially when I heard a few gunshots ring out in the night. After a few seconds, multiple gunshots started ringing out. I jumped up in surprise, but Chaz shoved me back down. He said they were simply warning shots, and I shouldn't get so uppity about something like this. Happens all the time, he said. A couple of moments later, an absolute hellfire of gunshots rang out. Apparently, those were just shots in the air too. I mean, they must have been, because they didn't seem to actually hit anything, and no one was crying out in pain or seemed to be shot. Chaz was eerily calm throughout this entire thing. That was probably the most unnerving thing to me. His dad was out on the front yard having a gun standoff with several armed men in pickup trucks, and he just sat there eating popcorn and watching a movie. I don't really have words for how scary this was. There was a long while of more gunshots, and eventually the truck sped off in a hurry. Chaz's dad came back inside with his gun. He didn't say anything to either of us. He just walked down to the basement, and that was the last time I saw him all night. I asked Chaz to explain what the hell just happened, and he seemed pretty disinterested. All he would tell me was that his dad worked with some guys, and they often had clashes like this. He said it wasn't unusual or even uncommon. No one ever really got shot too badly or hurt, though. He told me to just ignore it the next time it happened. I had to stay with Chaz for a long time because of circumstances, so this incident actually did repeat itself several times. They never told me what exactly was going on with these armed standoffs, but as weird as it seems, as it went on, I really did start to become more like Chaz and just ignore the whole situation. It was pretty surreal. My name is Nikki, and I had a really weird experience back when I was in college. It still haunts me to this day. When I was a freshman in college, I didn't get to experience the college experience the way many do. I didn't go to any of the football games, even though I'm a huge football fan. I didn't date any guys, and I didn't even go to a single party. I was so thoroughly concerned with succeeding academically that I put 100% of my focus into my schoolwork. It really paid off, and I did get straight A's all year, but I really felt like I was missing out on what college was supposed to be. As a sophomore, I decided to take part more socially. Not having made many college friends, this wasn't very easy to get into. I attended a few football games by myself and tried to join some various clubs. I really had a problem connecting with a lot of the other members, though. Where I was successful in making friends, however, was in class. Several classes, when we were put together for group work or whatever, I was able to really connect with my fellow students. By October, in my first sophomore semester, I was successful in making quite a few friends, and I got invited to a Halloween party. I was nervous going, and I guess I was right to be. Although I got to talk with a lot of my friends, it was only for short periods of time. It was a pretty wild party as it turned out, and they had plenty of other people to talk to as well. There was this one guy who was dressed up as what I guess was some sort of anime character. I wasn't really sure. He kept looking at me from across the room before eventually coming up to me. He said his name was Chris and asked me what I was drinking. I was having a rum and coke, and he started talking about how much he liked that. He offered to go and get me a new drink. I was so happy at having someone talking to me that I accepted right away. He left, and a few minutes later, came back with 2 rum and cokes. He handed me mine, and he started drinking his. After a while, he seemed to be getting hit really hard from the alcohol. He began slurring his words strongly, and eventually started swaying from being dizzy. I assumed he was either a real lightweight, or he had been drinking a lot beforehand. When he slumped against the wall and seemed ready to pass out, I got really concerned. I didn't know what to do in this situation. I sought out one of my friends. I told them he had only had a single drink. They called an ambulance just in case. I'll never forget what happened in that moment. We laid him down on his side and went to check if he was alright by checking his vitals. They just so happened to run their hands over his pocket, where they found he had a bottle of Rohypnol hidden away. It was in his system as well when they did tests after. I had an idea about what happened after that. Rohypnol is a common date drug, you see. I think Chris had gone to get drinks, and both drinks were rum and cokes. He had roofied one of them, intending to give it to me, but he ended up forgetting which one it was. He ended up drinking the one with the drugs in it himself. I'll never forget how lucky I was that night. In my college, all freshmen had to live in the dorms, and they had to live in either a double or a triple. I was a bit nervous about sharing the room with another person, and this only got even worse when I met the guy to be my roommate. This guy was named Kyle, and Kyle was really weird. He was sort of dark. I don't mean to say he was a goth or anything like that, because that's not really what I mean. Yeah, he did wear dark clothes and had dark makeup as well, but he was just so weird. He took it to a level that was much more than just an odd fashion statement here and there. He was involved with what he believed to be witchcraft, and I'm not just talking about Wicca or that sort of thing. He called the witchcraft he believed in black magic, and very often referred to entities he would pray to, and demons and that sort of thing. Now, I'm not particularly religious or anything, but everything he did just made me really uncomfortable. Things with Kyle were at first just annoying. He would always be awake at all times of night, and I always had to be up early for class the next day. He would sit at this little altar thing he'd made and talk to these demons by candlelight. He kept me awake all throughout the night, so I took to wearing earplugs and an eye mask to try and get at least some sleep. One night, though, I was woken up by a lot of noise that even my earplugs couldn't keep out. When I peeked out from under my mask, Kyle was having a three-way with another girl and guy on his bed. I just put my mask back on and pretended I'd never seen anything. So far, it had only been minor annoyances, but it turned very scary one day. I got home from class, and Kyle, who usually didn't pay much attention to me before, seemed really excited to see me. He told me he was communicating with one of his demons, and he needed someone's blood in order to do this further. He just straight up asked me if he could have some of mine. I turned him down, of course, and he insisted it would not hurt at all. I told him I wasn't really concerned about the pain. I didn't want him to use my blood for some nefarious ritual or something. He just kept on begging for my blood for a while, but I didn't relent at all. When he gave up finally, I could tell he was extremely pissed off at me. I didn't really care though, because at least he left me alone for the rest of the night. As usual that night, I went to bed with my earplugs and my mask on. I'm not sure how long I'd been sleeping before I felt a sudden and sharp pain surge up in my arm. I jumped up in bed, ripping my eye mask off immediately. There was a large slash in my arm, and Kyle was kneeling next to my bed, holding a ceremonial knife. The guy had actually sliced me open and started to collect my blood in my sleep. Enraged, I kicked him in the head, which knocked him down to the floor. I kicked the knife out of his hand and ran out the door. I ran straight to the RAS room and pounded on the door frantically. She answered and saw the huge slash in my arm. She called the campus police. Kyle was arrested soon after, and you can be damn sure I pressed charges against him. I know after he was taken out of my room, and I assume he was removed from the school as well. I don't technically know for sure exactly what happened though. I'm just happy I never saw that psychopath again though. I knew right away I was gonna have problems when I started living in the dorms. Growing up, I'd always had a room of my own, and being with another person was gonna be pretty hard to get used to already. When I first met my new roommate, he was actually a really nice guy. His name was Josh, and we got along really well. Still, it was difficult for me to always have another person hanging around all the time. There was definitely no privacy for me anymore in these small rooms either. About a month after I'd moved in, I was up studying late at night. Josh had been deep asleep for a while, when suddenly he just rose out of his bed like a zombie. He was only wearing his boxers. He got up and walked out of the room in his underwear. He didn't come back for about an hour. I tried to ask him where he'd gone like that, but he ignored me and went back to his bed, sleeping right away. The next day, I brought this up to him, and he told me he used to sleepwalk when he was little. He hadn't done this in a really long time, but had been concerned that he would start up again. He had a feeling it would start up when he went to college and added more stress to his life. He told me it was normally not that big a deal. He'd just walk and wander around for a bit and then head back to bed. He said it would be fine if I wanted to wake him up if I did anything weird. Apparently the rule that you're not supposed to wake up a sleepwalker isn't really true. Over the next few weeks, Josh did sleepwalk a few more times. I did wake him up once or twice when I thought he might get into some trouble. Sometimes, however, I couldn't. He would leave while I was sleeping, and when he came back into the room was generally when I would wake up. Anyway, the sleepwalking really wasn't that big of a deal until one particular night. Like I mentioned, it would almost always just involve him walking around in his boxers, but one night it took a really odd turn. I was deep in sleep when I began to hear some strange noises, which woke me up pretty quickly. I was still groggy and not able to pay that much attention to it until I heard the sound of something hitting the floor. Opening my eyes, I was immediately shocked. Josh had just opened the window and taken the screen off of it. He was climbing onto the windowsill of our second-story dorm room window. I jumped up to try and stop him, but before I could do anything, he fell out of the window as if it were nothing. Freaked out, I ran over and looked down. Josh was lying there in his boxers on the ground. There were a few students outside who had been unlucky enough to witness this. I ran out of the dorm still in just my boxers and sprinted down the stairs. I told the people around him that I was his roommate and that he was a sleepwalker. Fortunately, he survived the fall. Apparently, he'd landed on his feet, and the shock of the fall completely shattered both of his legs. Josh was okay and didn't remember anything about what had happened, or at least as okay as you can be with two completely shattered legs. I know this might not seem as scary to some of you, but you just need to imagine this picture. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night and seeing your best friend jumping out of a second-story window with no cause, as if it were nothing. I was absolutely terrified. I'm sure you've heard this sort of story 100 times before, but I think this one might be just a little bit weirder than most. Mostly that's because I live in a very rural area, and when this happened, I was in fact living out on a ridge all by myself. I won't give the name of this ridge though. I'd rather keep this strange story anonymous and not allow people to find my location. My house was way up on a hill and was about a 20-minute drive from the next closest house. We had a huge big yard, and on a clear night, you could see just about the entire Milky Way clearly. It was so dark out there, and there were no polluting lights around. Growing up in that house was great, other than that I had to get up nearly 2 hours before school started because the bus needed a long time to get there and back. Other than that, it was pretty nice though. This happened when I was 13 years old. My parents were visiting my grandmother, and I decided not to go with them this time. Usually, I'd get pretty bored when I went there, so I stayed in the house by myself instead. I was curled up on the couch in the living room and watching various horror movies late into the night. At one point, I got a sudden phone call. I didn't think to ask who it was. It was someone who wanted to speak to my father. He didn't ask for my father by name, though. He just asked, "Hey, is your dad home?" I stupidly told him no, and that he wouldn't be home for a few days yet. The guy didn't even offer to leave a message, and just hung up immediately. I very quickly put the incident out of my mind, but about an hour later, towards the end of a very scary movie, I was startled by a sudden knock at the door. I was even more surprised because I hadn't seen the lights of a car pulling up into the driveway. It would have been very obvious if someone had driven up here. I looked over at the clock and saw it was about 11 p.m. I think anyone, especially someone who lives in a rural area, would be a bit freaked out by someone suddenly coming to knock on the door this late at night. I didn't know how to react. I thought the best idea was to just not answer the door at all. I already had all the lights off, so maybe whoever was out there wouldn't know I was home. I had the remote control on the couch, and I quickly clicked the kill button to kill the light from the television. I hid under the blanket, just in case the guy looked in through the window. When I didn't answer, whoever was outside knocked again. He waited for a few moments. I still didn't answer the second time. When I still didn't respond, the person outside began banging really hard on the door, then started yelling, "I know you're home, and I know you're alone." He kept knocking on the door over and over. You might be wondering, why didn't I call the cops in that moment? Well, remember just how far away I lived. There was no way they would get there in time. I didn't even think about going to get my dad's gun either. I just stayed under those covers, shivering as the man continued pounding on the door. There was no way in hell I was going to answer it, obviously. Eventually, the guy gave up. I heard him knocking some things over on the porch. Then it was all quiet once more. I stayed on the couch covered up and didn't dare turn the television back on either. I mean, I didn't know if the man had gone to another door or window of the house just to hide. I didn't know if he could see inside. If I moved, maybe he would see me. Eventually, after quite a long time had passed, I fell asleep out of exhaustion. I woke up in the morning as the sun began to shine into the room. I felt very relieved a few hours later when the phone started ringing. I was scared to answer it, assuming it would be the same guy again. I had put 2 and 2 together at this point and figured that person must have been the knocker. To my fortune, though, the person on the phone was not that man. I answered it and was immediately informed it was the police. An old grandmother who lived a few miles down the road in a lonely house like my own had been attacked and brutally beaten the previous night. It happened only a few hours after the knocker had left my house. They were calling to warn us that whoever did the attacking was still at large and to exercise extreme caution. I just know it was that same man. Now first off, I'm a guy. I have to get that out of the way right away, because this is a story about pet cats, and I know a lot of people assume cats are more of a girl's pet sort of thing. I've always had a great fondness for felines. I mean, they're such beautiful animals. Sure, some of them can act really stuck up sometimes, but hey, they're cats. They have every right to do so. My parents bought me a cat when I was about 10 years old. His name was Greasy, for no better reason than I wanted to name my cat something I was sure no one else would have already done. He's still alive, actually. and is sitting next to me as I'm writing this story down. Even though I love my cat, I wanted another one as well. Cats are sort of like tattoos, in the way that you can't only have just one of them. My parents, on the other hand, didn't want me to have more than one pet. I recall around the time I was 12 or 13. One night, Greasy was getting a little more meowy than usual. He was also hanging around the front door. When I went to check out why, I noticed there was a young cat hanging out in the bush in front of our house. Having sympathy for the young creature, as well as just loving young animals in general, because he was a freaking cat especially, I decided I'd feed him a bit. I grabbed one of Greasy's extra bowls and gave the extremely hungry cat outside a small meal. The way I looked at it now was that I now had 2 cats. I named this stray cat Sebastian and even wrote the name on his bowl. I wasn't allowed to bring him into the house, obviously, and I didn't tell my parents much about him. I enjoyed my stray cat, though. He was awesome, and it was nice having one cat inside and one outside. My parents went to bed early because they often got up early for work. It was really easy to do this without them finding out because of that. I'm not really sure for how long this went on, but I guess it went on for a fairly long time. My parents didn't notice how quickly we were going through cat food, or perhaps they didn't care anyway. I always wished I could let Sebastian into the house, but of course I couldn't do so. Every now and then, Sebastian would eat his food early, then jump up on the window ledge and look inside. Whenever he'd do this, I'd pet him for a while. One night, I was watching some late-night television in the dark when I heard some rustling going on outside near the front door. I figured it was Sebastian looking for his dinner, so I grabbed his bowl and filled it up. When I went outside, however, he was nowhere to be seen. I tried calling out for him in a quiet voice, but he still didn't show up. I guess I stupidly figured he might be hanging out in the bushes. That was silly, simply because there was no reason for him to do that. He would always run towards me for the food. I walked over to the side of the house and nearly fell over in shock when I saw a figure dressed all in black sneaking underneath one of our windows. Shocked, I dropped the food. The man looked over to me. It only took a few moments for our mutual shock to fade and for him to immediately make a rush towards me. Having already dropped the cat food, I twisted around and quickly ran back to the house, screaming for my dad. I got to the door, opened it, and ran inside. I attempted to close it, but the guy shoved his arm in first. He grabbed the door and began trying to pull it open. We struggled back and forth for a moment, until suddenly the living room light turned on. When the light turned on, the would-be burglar realized he would be caught. He cut his losses and let go of the door. He jumped off the porch and ran for the hills, so to speak. My dad did call the cops. And to my surprise, the guy was actually caught as well. Sebastian did come back later to get his food too, although I was scared to go outside again. Still though, I put out his meal, and he was a very happy cat that night. Well, telling this story is going to date me a bit, I guess, but this happened when I was about 15 years old. I had been having a pretty severe case of insomnia, and as anyone who has suffered from insomnia knows, you can only lay in bed for so long before you just have to give up and find something to do. To let you know a little bit more about the situation, this happened in the summer. My parents were not home this night, as they had gone to a party. Knowing my father, he had probably gotten so drunk as well that they weren't going to be coming home anytime soon. He was one of those guys to get trashed, then refused to know when it was time to leave. Because of this, I was home all alone. I had actually started to drift off a bit when my body jerked. I'm sure you've had this happen before. It woke me up, and after that I wasn't able to get back to sleep. I tossed and turned and tossed and turned. Finally, I rolled over and looked at my clock. It was just a couple of minutes before 11:30 p.m. I figured I might as well get up for a bit and watch The Tonight Show. Maybe Johnny Carson would help me relax and put me to sleep. I walked up the hallway and into the living room without turning on any of the lights. I turned the TV on, then flopped down on the couch and stretched out a bit. I watched Johnny and began to feel a whole lot better after the beginning of the show. I went to turn the TV off and apparently got a bit of a static shock. This caused me to pull my hand away from the TV. Because of the suddenness of this action, I turned around, only to see, facing the couch, to my horror, a man hiding on the far side, crouched down in the small space between the wall and the couch. I screamed in shock. The man actually looked pretty surprised himself as well. I quickly sprinted out of the room and into the kitchen. My intent was to grab a knife. I found a big cleaver easily. I flipped the lights on and ran back into the living room to confront the man. The door was wide open, and the man had fled into the night. I called the cops as I did a thorough check of the house with cleaver in hand. The man was definitely gone now. All I could figure is he must have seen my parents' car gone, and the lights were out. He must have thought no one was home and tried to rob us. When he heard me get up, he didn't have time to get out of the house, so he hid in the corner. I don't think he expected me to stay up from insomnia and watch a whole hour of television. The man had been trapped there the entire time I was watching Johnny Carson. The man was right behind me, crouched in my house only a few feet away, and I never knew. I would have never known if I hadn't turned around from that sudden static shock. This happened about 20 years ago. I was about 9 years old at the time, but my parents have also told me their side of this story on a bunch of different occasions. Because of this, I have some details from them that should help paint a complete picture of the events. My parents are both biologists. They met at work, and from there it's a classic history. The place where they worked at the time was a government building dedicated to biology research used in government projects turned towards the public, meaning they were the ones studying the environment and making environmental protection laws around those studies. This, being a massive old government building, always had a security guard present, day and night. During the day, those security guards would mostly just stay at reception and greet people entering the building. At night, though, they would go do their rounds and make sure there were no intruders. All the science equipment and computers kept in the building could be a prime target. One of these guards is the bad guy of this story. Initially, he seemed like the nicest person actually. He was especially nice to me, and frankly, all the memories I have of him before this event were all genuinely pleasant. He would greet me and talk to me in the sweetest way every time my parents brought me into work. He would make me paper planes, which he was surprisingly good at, and play with me throwing them around. He would stay with me at reception on the days my parents had to work late into the night. Obviously, for me, that would get really boring really fast. He'd always keep me company and help entertain me. Mostly we would talk. Sometimes we'd watch TV together. All seemed innocent enough. Nice enough for my parents to trust him with me at least, which was probably their biggest mistake. One night, my parents had to work even later than usual. I think it was around 10 p.m. or so, and they were still deep into their work. This guy, who was on the night shift, decided to take me around the building with him to do his rounds. We started on the top floor, checking all the rooms and the exterior part of the roof. Every room was so dark that I'd always stay a little behind and wait for him to turn on the lights. We stepped down to the second floor, where my parents' office and labs were. We checked the opposite side of the building, going into labs with massive extractors, microscopes, every kind of science equipment you might think of. We walked down the stairs to the first floor, where the administration rooms were. I remember seeing some maps on the walls and embalmed fish everywhere serving as decorations. First floor was all clear as well, so now it was time to check out the 2 basement levels. I thought it would have made sense to check out the right side first. as the left side had a flight of stairs at the end leading up to where my parents were. For some reason, he decided we'd go check that side first though. We checked all the rooms together, but I noticed his pace was accelerating, and he was starting to look and sound happier and happier, quite excited even. Once again, we checked all the rooms, all the corners from one end to the other, turning on the lights ahead of us and turning them off behind us as we left. When we got to the last area, he turned all the lights on and we went inside. There were 3 separate offices in here. On the first one, he hurried towards the printer, opened it up, took out 2 pieces of paper, and made 2 quick paper planes. That's when everything changed. He picked up one of those planes, went outside the office, and threw it towards the end of the room. He then told me we were going to play a game. The plane he'd just thrown was mine, and that we could throw them around in here with nobody bothering us, back and forth. I ran to the other side of the room to retrieve my plane, excited to play a game with him, when suddenly all the lights switched off. When I turned around to check what just happened, I saw him sprinting out of the lab, turning all the lights off on the way, and locking the door behind him. I ran to the door, punched it and kicked it while screaming for him to open. Panic began to take over me because of how scared I was of being in the dark at the time. Through the glass on the door, I could see him scurrying away down the corridors, turning every light off as he went, and then disappearing into the darkness. I'm pretty sure that everything I felt and every creepy monster I saw in there while waiting was part of my imagination because of how scared I was. I balled up against a corner and could see things moving around me in the dark. I could only cry, lost without knowing what was happening and why he'd just suddenly do this. My parents finished their work eventually. When they did, they packed up their things and made their way to the lobby to pick me up and go home. Only when they got there, I was nowhere to be found. The security guard was back at reception, acting like he'd never seen me. They panicked, of course, must have shouted 100 different cuss words at the guy. I'm not sure how my dad didn't just attack him right then and there. When they asked the guy where the hell I was and what he'd done to me, he simply said he'd gone to do the rounds with me, and I must have gotten lost along the way somewhere. This was a building that would take you hours to check from top to bottom, even if you were rushing, so maybe they got lost somewhere was not exactly helpful. They searched the building for hours without finding me. It was only when I saw a light at the far end of one of the corridors leading to the area I was in that I got the courage to stand up, rush towards the door, and start hitting it as hard as I could. They finally found me there and made the guard unlock the door to let me out. I don't really remember sleeping that night, and if I did, it must have been out of exhaustion. I made my mom stay in the bedroom with me the entire night. Of course, my parents soon made a complaint against the guard. When they did, and the guy started being investigated, he was promptly fired and arrested. Not because of locking me away where he probably hoped no one would find me, but because he'd been partnering up with other criminals to steal computers and equipment from the building to sell in some shady market. He also sold the information in the hard drives to make money off it. By then, he had stolen a lot of equipment without anyone realizing. Who knows what his plans were for me that night. I'm not exactly convinced that locking a crying child in the middle of the darkness hidden away in some room in the depths of the building is exactly the most normal behavior. When I was 17 years old, my bedroom had this window looking out at my backyard. The backyard was fenced in, but on the other side of the fence were some woods and a retention pond. I'd never been scared of this, and always kept the blinds open, so that when the sun rose in the morning, the natural light would help me wake up on my own. One night, I was up late on my phone, while my dog was laying on the bed right next to me. At around 2 a.m., my dog jumped up and suddenly started barking at the window. At first, I thought he was just barking at his reflection and told him to stop. Then, though, I realized he was looking to the left side of the window, and I could clearly see his reflection was on the right. I couldn't see outside the window because I had left the lamp on my nightstand on. All I could see through the window was a reflection of my own bedroom. Not wanting to alert whatever might be out there that I was scared, I faked a yawn, set my phone aside, and turned off the lamp. I then laid down facing the window. I swear, I saw a set of human eyes looking back at me from the side of the window my dog had been aggravated at. I drank a lot of water that night, so coincidentally I had an empty bottle on my nightstand. I grabbed it and pretended like I'd just realized it was empty. I turned on the lamp and acted like I was going to get some water. I rushed to my parents' room, and my dad told me not to worry. We had these motion-activated floodlights, you see, and they hadn't turned on, so there was no way anyone was out there. I went back to my room and told myself I was surely just seeing things. I closed the blinds, turned off the lamp, and went to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I went to take my dog out and do his business when I decided to check the pine straw bedding underneath my window. It was visibly disturbed. I did my best to ignore that and remember what my dad had said about the floodlights. That did work pretty well until my dad tested the floodlights later that day and found that the bulbs had been burst out. To this day, I keep my blinds closed and my lamp off when I'm asleep. I don't want to risk anyone being able to see me, and if anything is somehow peeking through my window, I want to know if it's there. I'm sure there was someone looking into my window that night. I just don't know who they were. This might not be the scariest thing you've ever heard, but it's the first time I've had something like this happen to me, and it shook me up super bad. To set the scene, I'm 18 years old and live with my family very close to my old high school. Sometimes my youngest sister, who's 13, and I go to walk around the track while we listen to some music. Today after dinner, we decided it was a good time to go. It was still light out, and there were 2 other people on the track with us. The high school layout was kind of weird. The track was at the very bottom of this steep hill, with a wheelchair ramp and stairs going far, far down the hill to the actual football/baseball fields. Then there was a long path towards the cage basketball courts, closer to the actual school building. My sister and I were just walking around listening to our tunes, and it was starting to get a little bit dark. One of the men running had to leave, and the other one just walked out of the track with his dog. That's when this odd guy showed up. He had super long hair covering his entire face and was wearing all black. He had this giant black backpack slung around to the front of his chest as well. I'll be honest and say I got weird vibes immediately when he entered, but I had nothing to really base this off of. I assumed I was just being paranoid of a person appearing at dark as per usual. He entered towards the track area gate, but instead of going onto the track, he sprinted down the steep hill and hid away. I literally pointed out how weird this was to my sister as soon as it happened. What business did he have booking it down the hill towards the bleachers and hiding like that? But whatever. I kind of assumed he must have gone somewhere else, because we kept walking after that and didn't see him at all. As soon as the guy with his dog fully left though, the man who'd hidden on the hill entered the track where we were and started speed walking towards us. Now, to be fair, he could have been doing what we were and just listening to some music, getting an exercise. But he already freaked me out, and we had been walking for long enough that I decided we should go home right now. It was now getting really dark, too. As soon as he got on the track and started making a beeline towards us, I suggested we leave. Instead of heading towards the main gate we'd come from, closer to our house but right where he was, I made us go through the gate leading towards the stairs down the hill, so we would be going the long way around. Here is when I knew something was wrong. The man who had gotten onto the track less than 40 seconds ago immediately turned our way and started following us towards the gate we were leaving through. I was a little freaked out, so I started jogging. My sister thought I was just playing around, so she followed suit. I jogged down the stairs towards the football field and continued down the long path toward the only unlocked exit, which was all the way at the basketball courts. I guess my sister caught on soon though, because she turned her head, only to see the same man now sprinting down the stairs towards us. By the time we reached the end of the path, he'd already made it down the hill, and was clearly gaining on us. I was like, what the fuck? I immediately texted my dad because we lived so close, but I think he didn't see it because he was watching a movie or something. The man continued to sprint after us, speeding up the further along we got. It felt like a horror movie, to be honest. We eventually made it through the unlocked gate. My sister shoved it as hard as she could behind us, and we started speeding up the hill, the long way back to our home. Luckily, there was a woman walking her dog that way, so we kind of stuck near her because there weren't any streetlights on yet. We got back to the top of the hill, and the man was nowhere to be seen. I was so shaken already, though, that I made us jog back home so we could tell our dad what happened. I'm not sure why this man watched us from the hill, or followed us through the ridiculous long mazeway we took to get home, but I hope we never encounter each other again. I thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail, Nobo, in 2023, northbound for those of you who aren't familiar. It was an unbelievable experience I'll never forget. I met so many great people and had so many unforgettable experiences as well, including the one you're about to hear. I was in Vermont in an area called the Glastonbury Wilderness, which is located near the infamous Bennington Triangle. I was hiking alone at the time, as the rest of my family, my trail family, and I were all within maybe a mile of each other. We were scheduled to meet up at a hostel later that night. I was hiking through the wilderness area when I noticed that the forest and mountain around me had gone completely silent. No birds, no sound of critters. It even felt like the wind stopped as well. Prior to the hike, I've worked in forestry, and I've done a fair amount of backpacking before. Because of this, I knew this sort of behavior was indicative of a large predator being nearby. It's happened to me before, so I wasn't immediately terrified. I took note of it and continued to hike onward. Maybe about 10 seconds later though, just off to my right side and up the mountain face, something big was thundering around the woods. The footfalls were heavy enough where they seemed to echo out. I stopped hiking at this point and definitely felt the hairs on my neck and arms stand up. I was looking through the trees, scanning the foliage to see if I could spot anything, when I spotted something big and black or dark brown moving around in the trees. That thing was making these footsteps. It stopped moving for maybe another 10 seconds, then silence. Suddenly, something at least 7 to 8 feet tall stood up on 2 feet and looked right at me from behind some rocks. My body had never felt such a strong fight or flight feeling before, and I definitely chose flight. I'll never forget how intense that primal response was. I jumped up and hauled ass north on the trail, making sure to make lots of noise, as you're supposed to do when bears are near you. This thing, which at this point I was assuming was a bear, followed me for another 10 seconds before taking off back into the woods. I caught up with one of my hiker friends, and she said I was pale and spooked looking. I told her I saw what was fairly certainly a bear maybe a quarter mile back. After calming down a bit, we laughed it off as my first bear encounter. Now, if that was the end of the story, I would have totally believed it to be an ordinary occurrence in the wild, and while it was scary in the moment, I wouldn't have thought too much about it. Hikers see bears on the trail all the time. It's definitely a common occurrence. It's what I heard a few days later that scared me. A few days after that, a few hikers caught a ride from a shuttle driver to town for a resupply and back. We were chatting, and he asked us if we had any crazy stories to share. I didn't mention my encounter, because I was still thinking it was just a bear. After some more conversation and stories from the other hikers though, we asked him if he had any crazy ones. He told us that not even days ago, the same day I'd had my encounter to be exact, he got a call to pick up a hiker from a road crossing just outside the area where I was. She told him she was quitting the trail that day and asked to be taken to the airport. When he asked why, all she said was that she'd heard a baby crying in the woods, and when she looked around to investigate, she saw something running around in the woods and watching her. Apparently, it spooked her so bad, she left the trail immediately. I told the driver my story after that. The driver then told us he'd hiked and hunted in this area for years, and said bears don't get that tall, and moose don't stand up on 2 feet. The only thing he's ever heard about that is that some people will dress as Bigfoot and try to prey on hikers by themselves. Apparently, that's just a rumor though. I'm not sure what would be scarier, to be honest, actually seeing Bigfoot in the wilderness of New England, or seeing a psycho who dresses up as Bigfoot and was stalking me in the wilderness of New England. Either way, it's one of my more memorable trail stories. This happened at the end of summer in 2019. I, female, needed a distraction from my boring university revisions, and as lots of bored single people do, I hopped on Tinder. Nothing too serious really. I was too busy to meet guys anyway. I simply liked talking to people. One day I matched with a guy who we'll name Ted, who was in the same university as I was. He looked very handsome in his pictures. After talking for a few days on the app, and after I had wrongfully decided he was not a criminal, oh the irony, I gave him my number. Again, we talked for a while, then he asked to call me. Nothing too exciting, just the usual getting to know each other. We talked on the phone for a couple of weeks. He called me at random hours of the day and almost every night. I didn't really think that much of it though. During our phone calls, he mostly talked about himself. I didn't really mind though, because I didn't like talking much about me. It takes time before I trust anyone, and again, I was bored and a bit lonely. I'd been single for a while, so getting the attention felt quite nice. After a few weeks, Ted asked if I wanted to meet. I said yes because I'd finished with my exams. We met at the city center. When I saw him, I was kind of shocked. He looked nothing like the handsome guy in his pictures. It was definitely still him, you could tell, but good angles and Photoshop truly do make miracles is all I can say. I was a bit taken aback, but I'm not one to judge by looks anyway, so I went on with the date. Thinking back now though, there were some obvious red flags I missed. He kept asking weird questions like, "Are you shy? Why won't you stare into my eyes?" Well buddy, non-stop eye contact is really weird. I do need to take my eyes off you to pick up my beer from the table or light up a cigarette sometimes. The night went on and we'd had quite a few drinks. Usually I would never ask someone I just met to come home with me, but I was wearing beer mojito vodka goggles that made my brain blind. We left and spent the night together. In the morning I drove into the train station and went back home to have a nap. At the end of the day he called me and asked if we could meet again the next night. I wasn't really sure if I wanted to see him again though. I knew the only reason I'd brought him home was alcohol in the first place. We didn't really click at all on the date. The idea of rejecting him made me feel guilty though, so I agreed anyway. The day after that, he came to my place again, and there things started to get weird. I started to feel extremely nervous. Something was feeling really off. Thinking back, I think it was probably my guts telling me to get away from this guy. I decided to make things clear. I told him I was not looking for a serious relationship at all, at least not with him. I apologized and decided to bring him home. When we got in the car, he was quite angry. He didn't talk to me and I was embarrassed, so I didn't talk either. We arrived, he got out and slammed the car door quite hard. I knew I'd made quite a few mistakes here. I shouldn't have accepted another date with him knowing I was not into him, and I should have told him sooner I didn't want a relationship. I sincerely did not mean to act so badly. That's why I tried to be honest with him as I could. The next day, I called him and apologized again. He said it was fine and we hung up. I thought that would be it, but oh boy was that not. A few days later, it was time to get back to uni. That morning, I woke up to this gigantic message from him, telling me that the reaction I had a few nights before really threw him off, and he was looking for stability. As soon as I opened the text, he called me. It was 7 in the morning and I'd just woken up, so I couldn't really understand what he was saying. I simply told him again I didn't want to go any further with our relationship. He hung up, and for the next few weeks, things got even weirder. He started following me everywhere on campus, very obviously hiding behind walls to hear my conversations, texting me all hours of the day, even if I was not replying. Calling me 20 times a day even. I thought he was creepy, but that maybe he was hurt and was just coping. Ted was always with a guy we'll call Elliot as well. When I was at the library, they were always sitting together near to where I was. Ted was always watching me as I would study. When I went out for a break, he would follow me. It came to the point where my friends were texting me to warn me he was right behind me. I tried avoiding him, but it was useless. I told him many times I did not want any more contact with him, and he was making me uncomfortable, but nothing worked. He just kept going on, and I was going crazy. 2 weeks later, I was at a party where I met my now boyfriend. I fell in love very quickly. He's the most caring, loving man I've ever met. It's all lovey-dovey, yes, try not to puke on your keyboard. Anyway, in that moment, I knew I needed to put my foot down and stop being so acceptant of Ted's behavior. I explained to him one last time to stop contacting me, and finally blocked him. I truly thought it would be over now. He continued to follow me everywhere on campus though, except he was not with Elliot anymore. One day I was studying in the library. Ted was a few tables away from me, of course, when suddenly someone sat at the table in front of mine. It was Elliot. I looked at Ted and he was glaring at Elliot with the most murderous gaze ever. I thought it was weird. I had never spoken to Elliot before, and he never came near me at all either. I was creeped out. I thought maybe Ted had sent him to talk to me or something. But instead, Elliot just ignored me and I kept on studying. When I went outside for a cigarette, he also blocked Ted from following me. I was a bit surprised, but I didn't think much of it. A few moments later, Ted went outside. Elliot turned his head and watched him till he was out of sight. Then he turned to me and spoke in a hurry. "Hey, I really need to talk to you, okay? I think you're in some danger. I'm sorry, I know it's weird because we don't really know each other, but I'm really worried for you." I was stunned. I didn't know what to say. "We don't have a lot of time before he comes back. When you went out, he came yelling at me because I sat in front of you. When he leaves, we need to talk some more, okay?" I said yes, and I was shaking. At around 6 p.m., Ted finally left after watching me the whole day. We waited another hour to make sure he was gone. We didn't want him to know we were in contact with each other. At 7 p.m., we sat down in the cafeteria, and Elliot told me things that made me shiver. He explained that Ted had had really horrible discourses about women and how he would love to control them. He also explained that a few weeks prior, he'd started to have suspicions about Ted's behavior regarding university classes. He followed random classes every week, sometimes even showed up at Elliot's classes, although he did not follow them, and he didn't seem to have access to the university online platforms either. Elliot did a bit more digging and realized that his friend did not have a university email address, which every member of the university was supposed to have. Elliot went to the administration, and they confirmed what he'd suspected. Ted was not a student. He never was. After that, Elliot completely cut off contact with him. Since then, Ted was harassing him, calling and texting him all the time, following him everywhere. Elliot was shaking as he was telling me this story. I was shaken up as well. But what was coming would reveal itself to be even worse. Elliot explained he absolutely needed to warn me because Ted had started saying some really terrifying things about me specifically. I wanted to cry. Ted was talking about me all the time. Shortly before Elliot cut contact, it got to the point where Ted was making very detailed plans about how he was going to rear me. That he knew where I lived, that he could come whenever he wanted and get me by surprise. He even knew where I parked my car on campus, and he wanted to wait for me in the dark. He always said it with this joking tone, but Elliot got real freaked out. I had tears in my eyes. I knew Ted was a creep, but I could have never imagined it was that bad. At this point, we were near the end of the semester, but we still had a few weeks left. Elliot and I decided to take action because we didn't want to be terrified every time we were on campus. First things first, we contacted university security. Things were taken extremely seriously. One morning when I arrived, the walls were completely covered with posters with the campus emergency number. Elliot and I began constant contact with the chief of security, who was very concerned for our safety. They managed to catch Ted at the library and asked him not to come again. We also went to the police. I don't know the right term for it, but we didn't file a complaint exactly. The police added a note to his record so that if anything happened to us, the police would know what we were worried about in the first place. The officer seemed worried as well. I asked him why. He told me he wasn't allowed to say anything specific, but if I ever saw Ted outside of campus, I needed to call the police without hesitation. How reassuring was that? A few days later, I got a voicemail from Elliot. Told me that he knows things he was not supposed to know. Apparently Ted is mentally sick. He's regularly arrested and locked in mental hospitals. Drug addict, alcoholic, has violent tendencies, was already accused of attempted rape. He lived off invalidity insurance, which explains why he had so much time on his hands to come to university. I would have never guessed that when I met him initially. Later, I contacted one of my acquaintances who works closely with the police. They weren't supposed to, but they confirmed everything. Sent chills down my spine. After that, things calmed down. Ted was still somehow managing to skulk about campus, but he kept a low profile instead. He stopped following us. It was finally the end of the semester. I went away for a few weeks and never set a foot on the campus. I felt a bit relieved. When spring semester started though, Ted was somehow still there. Not following any longer, but always watching closely. I was so freaked out. Then, COVID hit fortunately. Since then, all courses are online, and I've not seen Ted again. I don't know if he's still creeping on people or if he's now officially a student or what. When I think of him, I'm still shaky. I hope I never run into him again. I live in a really scary-looking house. I inherited it from a fairly wealthy aunt when she passed away. In the town that I lived in, it was considered the spook house. Kids thought it was haunted, and a lot of them even thought my aunt was a witch for whatever reason. She wasn't a recluse or anything, but she did spend a lot of time alone. I was definitely aware of all of this when I decided to move into that house. I didn't really care much for it though. I've been a writer and am successful enough to live on the income I get from my writings, so I spent a lot of time at home anyway. Honestly, I came to wonder if the kids might think I was a witch just like they did with my aunt. I never heard any of them call me that though, and the kids didn't ever try to harass me or anything. Honestly, I think they were too scared to come anywhere near me or the house really. Anyway, I quite enjoyed living there. It was pretty big for only one person, but it was very comfortable. My aunt even had a reading robe that was on the east side of the house. It was filled with books and had a very comfortable couch for sitting and reading. I spent a lot of time in there reading some quality literature. One evening, I was reading a particularly good book when I began to feel this odd feeling for some reason. Even today, I can't really explain exactly what it was. It was just a very off feeling that I was not able to shake. It also kept me from being able to get lost in my book. After a while, I decided to get up and check around what was causing this feeling. The sun hadn't quite set yet, but it was in the process of doing so. Everything outside was a very bright orange color. I went out to the front room and looked out of the window. I didn't see anything at first, but then I noticed a dark figure run out of my yard and onto the sidewalk. It was from the very corner of my eye, and it happened so quickly I didn't get a good look at the figure. Knowing about the history of the house, I chalked it up to just being a kid doing something weird. Maybe one of his friends had dared him to go up to the spook house or something. Maybe he'd seen me in the window, lost his nerve, and ran off. Made perfect sense to me. I don't know how I had that sense, but it seemed unimportant to me. I decided to go back and get back to reading. After a while, I decided I wanted to get myself a cup of tea. I went in the kitchen to put on the kettle, and then I started to get that weird feeling again. This time, though, I turned around and looked out the kitchen window right away. I didn't see anything at first, but after a moment, I saw a bush shake just a little bit. It was dark outside already, so I really couldn't see very much at this point. Someone emerged from behind that bush and ran off into the darkness. Once again, I thought that some kid was trying to torment me, and I put it out of my mind for the moment. As I mentioned, I had accepted everything that came with the house, including the local children being silly sometimes. I didn't think it was too important, or that I should call the police or anything. They hadn't really done anything anyway. I got my tea ready and went back to read my book. I'm not sure how much time had passed, but then I began to hear something as well. It was like a light tapping noise. I thought maybe it was an animal outside, but then I realized it was rhythmic. I realized it had to be a person. I looked over at my window. My eyes adjusted, and I saw a human hand. It was reaching up from just below the window and tapping on the window panes. The first two incidents hadn't bothered me too much, but I considered this one to be going too far. I got up and walked over to the window. Someone was there, but when they saw me approaching, they quickly ran off toward the front yard. I was irritated enough that I ran through the house to the front door to confront them. I yelled out to whoever was out there that they should cut it out right now, or I would be calling the police. I didn't see anyone at all though, even though I had turned the porch light on and gotten there relatively quickly. I went back into the house, a bit annoyed but getting over it pretty quickly. I went back to reading. It seemed my threat had been taken seriously, as I wasn't bothered at all for the rest of the night. I was able to read and relax and then finally go to bed peacefully. I had been asleep for a short time when I was suddenly woken up by something. I wasn't sure what it was, but I thought I must have heard something outside. Instantly, I remembered the earlier incidents. Maybe that person had come back or something. I got up to investigate. I put on my robe and walked down the stairs without turning any of the lights on. I was used to the ambient light of the house, so I had no problem seeing until I got to the bottom. I saw something moving in the dark and turned on the light switch at the bottom of the stairs. I immediately heard a sound in the front room of the house. Going over toward that direction, a person sprinted out into the hallway. Only it was not a kid. It was a fully grown man. Before I could react, the man pulled a big knife out of his jacket. He warned me he would come back and kill me if I called the police. He was trying to cover his face with the arm while also brandishing the knife. I only got a slightly good look at him because of this. I was terrified, honestly. I figured he was just going to attack me right there and then. To my relief, though, the man ran out the door and into the night. Of course, I almost didn't call the police. I was so terrified he really would come back. I knew I had to, though, so I did. It was scary doing it, imagining this man might find out and come back to finish me. As far as I'm aware, the police never caught the guy either. I mean, that didn't mean he was free exactly. He could have been arrested for something else, but as far as I knew, he could come back at any time. For the longest time, this entire thing scared me to death. Little sounds and things like that would terrify me. I kept thinking it was that guy coming back. Fortunately, though, he never showed up again. The terror from that incident and the possibility of him following up on his threat, though, has stuck with me for a very long time. I have an in-ground swimming pool in my backyard. It was one of the necessities I required when looking for my own house. I swam in high school and in college, so it was a really big part of my life that I enjoyed doing. I had to have a pool when I eventually bought a house because of this. I'd had a tough work week, so I just wanted to do everything I could to relax over the weekend. I was looking forward to the time just swimming in my pool. It was already getting dark outside by the time I arrived home on Friday. Still though, I swam many times in the pool at night. and I knew I needed a real good swim to relax. When I turned on the light by the pool and went outside, I noticed that the backyard light in my next-door neighbor's house was on too. I didn't think about it very much though. We had a fence between the yards that was pretty high, and I definitely had all the privacy in the world in my backyard. I was swimming for a while when I suddenly heard something. It was like a little plopping sound, like something had just fallen into the pool. I mean, it's not unusual for something like that to happen in an outside pool, but I also like to keep the place as clean as possible. I immediately started checking, trying to find out what this was. I had to go underwater to check fully, and what I found was what looked like a piece of rock lying at the bottom of the pool. It was kind of like white gravel, like you'd see used on a road or in a driveway somewhere. I surfaced and took a closer look. It was definitely what I had thought it was. It was a little confusing though, because how could something like that have just landed in my pool suddenly? I didn't think too much of it in the moment though. I just set it to the side and went back to enjoying myself. Soon after though, there was another plop. This was followed quickly by another, and then suddenly something hit me right on the head. I could assume right away that all of this was gravel, like the one I'd found before, even though I hadn't checked thoroughly yet. Suddenly, tons of pieces of rock came flying, and I saw where they were coming from. They were being tossed over the fence from my neighbor's backyard. Trying to get away from this assault of rocks, I wasn't sure what I could do exactly. I was absolutely confused as to why my neighbors, who I didn't know but never had problems with, would even be doing something like this to begin with. I took some deep breaths and dove underwater so I'd be hurt less if I was struck by a rock. I swam to the end of the pool that was closest to my house, but before I could surface, I felt someone grab onto my head and begin holding me underwater. I did my best not to panic. I was pretty good at holding my breath, so I tried to remain as calm as possible. I tried to pull the hands off my head though, but it was extremely hard to do with no leverage. From my perspective, I didn't really think I would be drowning anytime soon, but it did seem this was the intention of whoever was doing this to me. I kept fighting them for a little while, and then suddenly the hands stopped holding me down. I immediately surfaced and took a breath, while also looking around. All I could see though was a figure running out of my side yard. I wasn't able to make out anything about the figure though. I decided it made more sense to go into my house and call the police than it did to go running after the guy, so that's exactly what I did. When the police arrived, they discovered that no one was next door at my neighbor's house. In fact, we found out later that my neighbors had been gone all week. They had left town for a family vacation. However, their house had been lived in, most likely by whoever it was that attacked me that night. They had no idea who it could be though, or why the person would have just attacked me like that out of nowhere. This is a story from a couple of years ago, when my buddy, 19, and I, 17, were out running and stumbled upon something very strange. I lived in quite a small town at the time, with a large industrial plant nearby, where most of the people there worked at. There were a few that didn't get their breadcrumbs from legit sources though, for example, the local gangs. Luckily, when they had their disputes, they usually just shot and harassed the other gangs in the area, and mostly spared the locals who lived there. I had not stumbled upon any unrest in this manner, and had never been in any crossfires before this day. My buddy and I were preparing to take a long run around town, taking some small roads and trails to get the miles clocked in. We started running some back roads, and were enjoying the run and the small talk about some games we were playing at the time. We took some right and left turns, and after a couple of miles, my friend said he knew a small path to the next neighborhood. It was a path over some train tracks, where there were usually no trains running, so it was safe to walk over. It was quite a fun path as well, with many ups and downs. There was nice forest scenery too, a very sparse pine forest with some large trees mixed in. We ran for 1 minute on this path, when we saw a bit further down, there was a duffel bag laying under a small bush on the right side of it. Obviously, this was new here, and it seemed to be full of something as well. In my head, I was thinking at first someone might have forgotten it there, but then I remembered that this path was not a path someone would just go down with a duffel bag. Usually, it would be people just running past like us. I turned over to my friend. "Hey, do you see that bag?" He answered, "Yes." I asked him, "Should we look and see what's inside?" "Nah, it's probably nothing in there." We continued down the path, and didn't think that much of it. Here's where the strange part comes, though. We had just passed the train tracks, when a couple of yards further down, we saw a man standing in a black suit, who seemed to be having a serious conversation on the phone. He seemed quite surprised to see us running from that direction as well. He had black gloves on, was quite muscular. His phone also looked like some sort of prepaid device. My heart started racing, and my adrenaline started pumping. What was a man with a suit like this doing here in the forest? I tried to act cool and nodded hello to him. He was still on his phone talking to someone, and seemed not to mind us running beside him on the path. A while after we encountered this strange man in the black suit, though, we both thought to each other, what was in that bag? He must have been looking for it. That's when I fully understood what could have happened to us if we had decided to check that bag and take it with us, or even just search the bag's contents at all, and the man stumbled upon that discovery. Before we begin, let me give you a little description about myself. I'm a 20-year-old college student who's been back home for the summer recently. I also happen to be extremely small, 4'11" to be exact, 105 pounds with a serious case of noodle arms, literally zero muscle. Now let's get to the story. Last night around 8:30 p.m., I was walking the dogs with my mom. We have two dogs, Daisy and Major. Daisy is the senior. At 13 years old, she has bad arthritis because her torso is too heavy for her stubby legs. Because of this, we make it a point to not take her on long walks anymore. Before we even made it to the main street, Daisy went to the bathroom right away. I told my mom she could go ahead and head back home, while I took Major with me for a longer walk. My mom was hesitant about this though, and at first she refused. I knew my mom had some work she had to get back to, so eventually I did convince her to go back. I told her it was just a short walk and I had our German Shepherd mix with me anyway to protect me. Finally, she agreed, but told me to be careful and make sure no one was following me. A little bit weird and specific, but I agreed nonetheless. Now, I should add that I didn't have my phone with me at the time. It was about to die before our walk, so I had left it to charge at home. Still, I was confident, because I'd walked dogs on this street numerous times before, and never had an issue. From there, I turned left from the street we lived on and onto the main road. This made it so the traffic going in the opposite direction would be closest to me. Every building on the main street was some sort of doctor's office, and all of them were closed at this time. The parking lots were all empty as well. I walked for a bit on the left side, before deciding to cross over to the right side of the street where the dentist's office was, just past the vet area. Before I could do that though, there was a car approaching on my side of the street. I waited patiently for them to pass before walking across. As I was walking, I took note that the car that passed by was red. I stopped just before the dentist's parking lot. Usually I just walk behind the dentist's office, but this night I hesitated. After a full minute of Major sniffing at nothing of interest, I decided against going back there and walked past the front instead. I opted to go back the long way home. Not even 30 seconds after I decided not to walk in that direction, a car pulled into one of the two entrances of the parking lot and parked in a parking spot as if waiting for me. I had never seen anybody pull into the lot of this street so late at night before, so I was immediately suspicious. I checked behind me. checking to make sure it was not the same car I'd seen just a minute ago. After 30 seconds went by, the car pulled out from the parking space, jerked back to the other entrance, the one closer to me, then pulled out just far enough for me to see it was in fact the same red car. I still couldn't conclude they were following me just yet, so I remained calm and kept staring as I continued to walk away. Just before the end of the block I'm on, I pulled Major and I off the sidewalk. That's when the car swerved from the lot and beelined towards where I was. I pulled us even further away, behind a tree that Major decided to mark, completely oblivious to the situation. The red car was about to pass us when it slowed down. I was using the tree as a shield to hide behind, glaring at the car through the branches. The car eventually moved past me, instead of coming to a complete stop where I was. I took the initiative to immediately change my trajectory and start going back the way I came. My hope of the car simply continuing down the street died immediately when he took a hard left and swerved into the parking lot right across from me. He accelerated across the lot as he turned the car to face with his headlights on me. By now, my adrenaline had kicked in. I became extremely upset. Not only was he following me, but he was also driving erratically. It was starting to scare the shit out of me. Keep in mind, there was also nobody else driving on the main street. I thought I was effectively alone, until I saw a silhouette walking towards me on my side of the street. I couldn't be sure because it was so dark out, but I thought it could be my mom. She has a short stature like me, but it was hard to tell from this distance. If not her, it could be someone taking a walk. I continued walking towards them to see if it really was her. Just then, the car accelerated again and pulled into the lot adjacent to the one they were just in. I started quickening my face, when finally the vet's light flickered on and illuminated my mom's face. "Mom?" I called out as I quickly turned my head to watch the red car repeat its pattern of turning into the next lot, then continuing towards me. "Yes, it's me." She too was eyeing the strange red vehicle as she waited for me to catch up with her. I was a little dismayed to see she didn't seem to be carrying her phone with her. Nonetheless, when I got within earshot, I vehemently stated there was a maniac on the loose. To my surprise, my mom said, "I know." The man was about to repeat his crazed cycle when I finally got to see what he looked like. He must have put his window down at some point because I could see his side profile as he drove his car erratically in the street once more. Except he wasn't looking at us. The curly, bald man was looking at his car dashboard as weird beeping noises emanated from his car. I had to actively fight the urge not to yell at the man to get lost. The driver became even more erratic. He pulled into the next lot, then drove over the curb into another lot on the next block. We took that opportunity to cross the street back towards our house, but that also brought us closer to him. He must not have expected us to cross, though, because he drove far enough ahead to allow us to pass him from behind. He gave us a good view of his bumper, too. His license plate read CMMJ65. We were now in the home stretch. I wasn't looking back as often at that point. I just wanted to get home. My mom, however, said she saw him turn around again to face our street. He may have kept watching us from there, but we had no way to know for sure. My mom explained to me that when she got Daisy back inside, she told my stepdad to feed her. She had to run back outside to get me. She said the whole time she'd walked back home, she couldn't shake this bad feeling about me. She just had to come back and make sure I was okay. Then she got to see for herself how this deranged driver was swerving in and out of lots, trying to follow me. Once we made it home, we reported this incident to the police. We gave his license plate number and described what happened. The dispatcher even commented how weird this was. I don't want to know what the guy was thinking. I'm just so happy my mom had the intuition to come find me. I don't know what I would have done to get myself home otherwise. The rest of that night I spent it awake and wondering what I could have done better in that situation. I was afraid that if I tried to run, it would have provoked him, and he would have really tried to chase me. Then there wouldn't have been any way to outrun him. I wonder what would have happened if I'd gone behind the dentist's office before I decided not to. I don't like thinking about it. My mom thinks the noise is coming from his car or some sort of police radio, and that's another terrifying thought in itself. When I was 19 years old, I moved out of my parents' house and rented a little studio apartment by myself. At the time, I was going to school full-time and working at least 30 hours a week as well. I had a job in a small sub-sandwich shop. Because school was so expensive and I really needed the money, I agreed to work on Thanksgiving night. My family was a bit upset that I wouldn't be coming over, but they understood that I really needed this. I knew going into that workday that I would be by myself after 5 p.m. We didn't exactly expect the place to be packed and busy on the Thanksgiving holiday. I had worked there since I was 16, so I was trusted to close the store all by myself. Around the time that my last coworker left, the snow also began to start falling. So now, in addition to being slow due to being Thanksgiving, the snowfall was killing off any business we might have had. I decided to try and make the best of it though. I went and grabbed my astronomy textbook out of my bag and tried to spend some time reading and studying. I wasn't aware of how much time had passed before I finally noticed someone outside the shop. By this time, the snow was falling so hard that there was no visibility at all, beyond a foot or two in front of you. I could still see the silhouette of a man. He came into the foyer and began shaking the snow off his body. I put my book to one side and went over to the counter. I put my gloves on and the guy walked in further. I felt uncomfortable right away. Not just because I was alone though. It wasn't the first time I had ever been in the store by myself with a customer. There was just something about this guy though. He just had a weird air about him that made me feel very uneasy. He kept on glancing around the place, like he was extremely nervous for some reason. He was also a pretty big guy. He was wearing a jean jacket in the middle of a snowstorm, which was quite odd as well. He walked up to the counter and began looking around. When I asked him if I could help him, he looked amused. "I guess you must be one of the lower employees," he commented. Confused, I asked him what I meant. "Well, I figure it's the lower employees they force to work on Thanksgiving," he said. "New people, maybe no family to go home to." I forced a weak smile. "I do indeed have a family to go home to," I assured him. "I'm just working late because I need the money." "That's too bad," the man responded. When I asked why he said that, he then responded with this: "Because your family's Thanksgiving is going to be ruined when they find your body in the dumpster out back." If you've never had someone threaten your life out of the blue, I can't even tell you what it felt like. It was what I would imagine being hit by a lightning bolt would feel like. He said that with a smile on his face, but the look in his eye indicated he was not joking at all. I looked over at the phone on the wall by the register. When I did, he shifted to the side, indicating he would get to me before I even dialed a single number. Though I was scared to death, I suddenly made the smartest decision I ever made. I was still behind the sandwich counter, so I grabbed the knife and threw it at the guy. This clearly surprised him, and while he was falling backward off balance, I turned and ran back to the manager's office. I slammed and locked the door. He hopped over the counter in a matter of seconds and tried to force the door open. It was impossible though. The store safe was kept in that room, so there were no windows and the door was quite heavy. I grabbed the phone on the desk and called the police right away. By the time they got there though, the guy was obviously long gone. I'll never forget the look on his face and the sound in his voice when he mentioned my family finding my dead body in a dumpster. A few years back, I was making a ride home from college for the Thanksgiving break. I was a freshman at the time, and Thanksgiving break was the first bit of freedom I'd had from a really hectic schedule. I decided that even though it was a long drive home, I would enjoy the free time to think. I have to admit that back then I was still rather idealistic. I tried to see the good in everyone, and it caused me to make quite a few mistakes. A very good portion of the ride was driving through cornfields in the middle of nowhere. I'd hit a small town, then drive for miles through cornfields, then hit another small town. It didn't take long for this to begin getting quite old. I began getting very bored in the late evening when I saw a guy walking along the side of the road all alone. Maybe because I felt like it was a chance to do a good deed, or more likely because I was so bored, I pulled my car over and offered the guy a ride. If you've ever picked up a hitchhiker, occasionally you pick someone up and you immediately regret it. I sort of had that feeling in this case. The guy was only a few years older than me. He was lanky and had long black hair and a big scraggly black beard. He was wearing dirty blue jeans and a Metallica t-shirt. None of that was what bothered me though. If that sort of thing bugged me at all, then my college campus would have been a complete nightmare. It was filled with people like that. No, what got me about this guy was the way he talked. If I remember correctly, his name was Travis. After introducing himself, he then asked me if I'd ever picked up a hitchhiker before. I told him I'd done it once or twice when I was a teenager and still living at home, but it was only ever other high school students. After I told him that, Travis began talking all about hitchhikers, and it wasn't positive stuff either. He began rambling about how dangerous it was to pick up random hitchhikers, and hadn't I heard about all the serial killers who posed as hitchhikers along the side of the road at night? He then started listing off several killers who'd been involved in hitchhiking. This absolutely sent a cold chill down my spine. He not only listed them out, he began talking about how they committed their crimes and how they could have done it better. I was nervous and about to ask him to stop the car and get out. However, before I could even open my mouth, he reached into the pocket of his jeans jacket and pulled out a pocket knife. I felt a jolt inside me, but hoped he didn't notice. Travis flipped out one of the blades of the knife and immediately began cleaning his fingernails with it. I did my best to pretend like I wasn't even noticing. I asked him again where he wanted me to take him. He lived in a house just outside the next town, he said. I asked him what he was doing so damn far away from home. He said he was visiting some friends, and they hadn't offered him a ride home. I just kept trying to think of a way to get rid of this guy. My fuel gauge gave me that opportunity at least. I was going to stop the car at a gas station and try to get away from him. I noticed the gauge was pretty low. We were in a town at this point, and I knew I could find a gas station nearby. My plan was to leave him in the car, then go into the station and call the cops. I let Travis know I needed to grab some fuel and asked him if he knew where a station in town was. It didn't take me long to find it on my own though. I pulled in and filled up my car while Travis sat inside fiddling with his knife. I let him know I was going inside to pay. It was at that point he surprised me. He jumped out of the car holding his knife to me. "I'll go in with you," he insisted. "I think I could use a drink." My plan was ruined. I wasn't sure how in the hell I would be able to get the attendant to call the police if Travis was in there with me. I thought quickly as we were walking, and I pretended I'd left my wallet in the car. I told him to head on in and grab himself whatever he wanted. I let him know I would pay for everything. Travis nodded and eyed me, then headed into the station. I went back to my car, only to notice him watching me from the door of the station. It took all of my nerves, but I started the car up right away. I saw him immediately come out of the gas station, running at me with his knife at the ready. I put the car in drive and took off quickly. Travis was screaming at me to come back, but that wasn't going to happen. I had to drive straight to the police department for a couple of reasons. I didn't really have anything on Travis they could arrest him for, but when I had driven away from the gas station without paying, which is a crime, I knew I had to do something about that. I had to go back and let them know what happened later, and pay for the gas as well. The police accompanied me back, and I paid the clerk soon after. Thank God by that time Travis was long gone. The strangest thing that ever happened to me happened on Thanksgiving when I was about 10 years old. My dad was working that night, so my mom and me were the only ones home for dinner. We lived in a slightly rural area. What I mean is that we weren't way out in the country, but the houses in the neighborhood were not side by side either. Ever since I've grown up, we've started having Thanksgiving dinner earlier in the day. When I was younger, my parents didn't do it that way though. In fact, I was a bit surprised when I found out it was normal to have it earlier in the day. We always had our dinner in the evening, no different than we would for any other meal. This year was the first that we were going to be having it without my dad home. He had been promoted recently, and part of that promotion had him working on holidays. That part was truly terrible, but he did make a lot more money, so we had things a lot nicer the rest of the time. My mom and I were just sitting down for dinner when we heard a sudden knock at the door. My mom got up and went to answer it. When she came back, I asked her who was there. She said at the time it was not important. However, later in life she explained to me that it was a drifter who was begging for food. She had offered to give him something, but apparently he had wanted to come inside and eat with us. She refused, of course. She offered to bring him some food to the door even. When he wouldn't accept that, she told him to just leave right now. The two of us sat down at the table, and we'd barely begun eating when we heard a loud shattering noise. The man had thrown a large rock through our living room window. My mom got up and immediately went to phone the police. I went with her, holding onto her leg as fear gripped me. I saw the drifter through the window. He hadn't smashed the hole big enough for him to fit through, though he was reaching inside with one hand and trying to break more glass off with the other. He began moaning, "I just want some turkey. Bring me some turkey." It was so weird and terrifying. He succeeded in breaking off more of the glass, which caused his hand to begin bleeding profusely. My mom grabbed me and shoved me into her bedroom. She sat me down on the bed, then went to the closet and pulled out my dad's rifle. I was scared to death already, but being a 10-year-old kid, I was also scared of the idea my mom was about to shoot a guy. Yeah, I know he was trying to break into our house, but it was still frightening. My mom left me in the room and locked the door behind her. I heard her yelling at the guy, but I couldn't make out either the words or his response. I just buried my head deep under the blankets. After a few more heated exchanges, I heard a gunshot that scared the hell out of me. I tried to be quiet for a few moments. Afterwards, I heard another gunshot. My mom came back to the room and locked the door behind her when she was inside. We then waited for the police to come. They got there pretty quickly, surprisingly. It took a while before I knew what truly happened. My mom hadn't shot at the guy. She'd fired off a warning shot. When the guy doubted she would use the gun on him, and the warning shot hadn't scared him off, she fired another shot right next to his head. He quickly fled. The police picked him up pretty quickly after. It's quite weird, huh? Thanksgiving is not supposed to be the scary holiday. Now this happened a very long time ago. It was in 1976. To indicate how disturbing it was for me, it's taken me this long to really talk about it. My best friend in high school was a guy named Bryant. When we graduated, we ended up going to different colleges, so we didn't get to see each other that much. Communication in the 70s wasn't quite as easy as it is nowadays. There was no email, and expensive long-distance communication meant we could only really communicate with postcards or letters. We had an agreement, though, that in the beginning of every single summer vacation, the two of us would go camping together for a week. I won't mention where we went camping. Just know that it was in a large forested area. We had a map, of course, and we tried to see how far we could go in our half a week before turning and making it back. We slept in different tents. The morning after the third night of hiking, Bryant told me he hadn't slept all that great. He said he kept hearing a rustling sound in the leaves outside his tent. He actually thought there was a human being out there, walking around our camping area. I didn't really believe him, though. I told him it was probably just an animal. I couldn't think of any reason why a person would be circling our camp in the middle of the night, out this far into the wilderness. The following morning, Bryant once again looked like he hadn't slept very much at all. When I asked him, he told me he'd again heard the same rustling around our camp as he had the night before. He insisted again it really was a person. I wasn't really sure what I could tell him. I mean, if it was a person, there wasn't a whole lot we could do about it. We were already beginning to head back anyway, so I couldn't just say, hey, let's turn around right now and leave. We were already in the middle of doing that. The next night, usually I would fall asleep pretty quickly. However, I decided I would try and stay up to see if I could hear what Bryant had been hearing. I tried to stay up, but I kept feeling my eyes trying to close up on their own. I kept catching myself and jerking my head up to stay awake. I think it was when I was just beginning to drift off that something fully pulled me out of my sleep. There was some noise, some rustling coming from around the camp. That immediately woke me up. I listened in closely. Bryant really had been right. It sounded like someone was circling our camp. I mean, I had no way of knowing if it was a person instead of an animal, as Bryant had claimed. But I guess I didn't know why an animal would be circling us all night for days, rather than actually doing something. Needless to say, I did not sleep very well that night either. Eventually, I pulled it off though. When I got up, I noticed that Bryant hadn't gotten up yet. I decided to let him sleep for a while longer. He likely needed any sleep he could get. However, when an hour passed by, and he still hadn't gotten up, I decided to wake him up myself. I called out his name, but there was no answer. I knocked on his tent, which is quite the funny thing to say, I admit. Still no answer. I called out louder, but there was no response. I never would have opened his tent without his permission, but now I was quite worried. I opened the tent to wake him up, but I saw he wasn't there. I was still a bit worried, but now I figured he'd probably just woken up early and went out on his own. Another hour passed by though, and he still didn't come back. I kept calling out for him, but he never responded. I combed the area, and I couldn't find him at all. I can't begin to describe you how difficult this situation was. I waffled over just looking for him by myself or booking it to a ranger station. When I'd spent a significant amount of time trying to find him, and failing, I finally went to a ranger station. A search was organized. The search had no better luck than I had, though. They didn't find a single trace of him. That was 41 years ago, and I haven't seen nor heard hide or hair of him since that day. They never found a body, living or dead, but I never saw my best friend again. I have no idea what really happened to him, but my view was pretty much that whatever happened to my buddy, it had something to do with whoever was circling our tents in the night. I like to take an annual camping trip all by myself. I live in New York, but I was actually raised out in the country. Every year I have to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life and just enjoy nature for a bit. About 5 years ago, though, I had a really scary occurrence while out on my annual trip. I was out for a good hike, maybe about 2 days in, when I came across something that really surprised me. What was such a surprise to me was that there was actually an old cabin just out in the middle of nowhere in the mountains. Immediately, every horror movie about a cabin in the woods shot through my head. You know how you watch a horror movie and you see someone do something really stupid and you yell at the person and wonder how they could be such an idiot, then tell yourself that in that similar situation, you would never do anything stupid. Well, it seems that's much easier said than done. I did the stupidest thing. I went in to explore the cabin. It was old and rotted, and the floor made unbelievably loud creaking noises as I walked across it. It was a bit of a rush, actually. I kept expecting someone to jump out at me and scare the crap out of me. It was pretty obvious, though, that no one had been here in a very, very long time. There were some really neat things in the cabin, though, and nothing was really scary in there. There was some very unique rustic furniture that had almost completely rotted away. Mostly, it was like getting a view of a time long past. There were a few doors inside, and I opened them to see what the other rooms were like. There was a very rustic kitchen area, a very rustic bathroom. The third door I figured had to be a bedroom. I thought I should check it out. I opened the door, and indeed it was a bedroom. My heart practically stopped, though. I saw there in the bed, with the metal frame and rotted comforter on it, was a human skeleton. It was tied, about 8 straps if I remember correctly. What got me the most was that it didn't look like they were wounded. I crept up on it, looking around. I didn't see anything that could indicate why this person had died. I thought possibly someone had tied this unfortunate person to the bed and starved them to death or something. I mean, I guess they could have died some other way. I'm just telling you what went through my head at the time. I marked this area and the cabin on my map. I was surprised the cabin hadn't already been marked there. When I got out of the woods, I reported it to the police. But even though the body was probably there for a long time, and whoever tied them down was long gone, getting out of the mountains was such a creepy experience. I started hearing noises and got very jumpy. I kept thinking someone was following me. That likely wasn't true though. It was just a completely freaky experience that had me on edge.